Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Mundo honey processed Honduras from H&S Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And H&S, based out of Laramie, Wyoming. And they were a suggestion to us by Mac and Devon Greer. So shout out to and thank you to both of you for the suggestion. This is H&S's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. And interestingly enough, they were one of the most discussed coffee roasters in our most recent American and Canadian coffee roaster tier list, as so many of you guys were interested in hearing our feedback on this coffee roaster. So I went out and purchased one washed and one non-wash processed coffee from them, with this coffee right here being that non-wash processed coffee. So we will see how it turned out, as this right here is day 38. And H&S actually has two recipes for this coffee on their website, which are at either a 16:1 or an 18:1 water to coffee ratio. So we opted for the 16:1 water to coffee ratio on this one, brewed at 198 degrees Fahrenheit, about 92 degrees Celsius. And I actually like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, they do have it here listed on the bag as being a light profiled coffee, and I could definitely agree with that. Even with the processing, you can definitely tell that this one is on the lighter side of things, and even then it's still probably a little bit lighter than maybe that light might indicate, as this was a pretty light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and there was definitely a notable bit of fermentiness to it. And what I do like about H&S is that they list on the coffee itself, so when I went to purchase the coffee, that there is at least a little bit of funk. So I think it was level 1 funk detected here, and you can definitely feel that on the first try, as it did have a slight bit of fermentiness to it. It does come off surprisingly citric bright at the forefront, with the cup very much being in line with the listed passion fruit. Other characteristics included a strong cherry component, lending itself to an okay first start. And I should probably say that when I went and purchased this coffee, I said, very little of this actually sounds like my type of coffee, but given that this is a honey processed coffee, I can kind of get away with this acting as my non-wash processed coffee in the hopes that it might not be as heavy as some of the other processed coffees. But we continue on to day 17 as we opted for the Chemex, and there was definitely more intensity to it, as it reminded me a little bit of the old school Paraíso Diego coffees, with plenty of the funk in terms of the tropical fruit profile to it. And I like to reference those coffees mostly because those were the first coffees I had ever had that really seemed to offer such a wild and different characteristic, and I continue to relate that all the way back to, I want to say that was 2019 or so. Passion fruit definitely felt apt, as it's quite strong within the cup, as there's complementary apple brightness to it. So for the most part, it's been very much in line with a lot of the descriptors that they had on here. We move on to day 20 as we opted for the April brewer, and the cup continues to offer some brightness in both the tropical and citric sense, with a slight bit of funkiness to it, but still then not in an overly strong sense. There's a fair bit of it, but not necessarily to the extent to where it just continuously dominates the cup. It does cool down into a pretty unique candied cherry and chocolate component to it, so interesting nonetheless. We move on to day 23 as we opted for the V60 with H&S's recipe, and H&S's recipe is very interesting. So they have that 18:1 at 198 degrees Fahrenheit, and I was really unsure what to make it the first time I tried it, and I said this could actually go really well for this coffee, given that this coffee is so intense. And there was much more clarity to it, mostly because it just felt like a diluted version of this coffee. It felt like a diluted version of the Paraíso coffees that I'd mentioned, with the passion fruit lingering in the background, but the entire cup I said, this thing, it just feels hollow. It doesn't necessarily feel like it has the sort of intensity that I would expect from a coffee like this. So yeah, I think it's much more given that there was just such a strong water ratio within this coffee, and the temperatures were so low that it really didn't remind me of some of the earlier days. It was just such a stark contrast to it. It did have a kind of mouth-coating brightness nonetheless, so it had the characteristics to it, just much more diluted and toned down. We continue on to day 26 as we opted for the Chemex with their recipe, and it was interestingly the best that had been to this point. I felt like the dilution actually helped this with the intensity, as there's still somewhat of it in the chocolatey sense, but outside of that, the strong fermentiness is toned down, with the tropical being notably more even. The lingering tropical finish is still offering a very sharp brightness. That's the best way I could kind of describe this brightness, is it's just so sharp and strong within the cup. Day 29, another try through the V60 with H&S's recipe, and with some adjustments to the pouring structure, I felt like it was back to being on the more intense side of things with an abundance of the passion fruit at the forefront. It's still offering some slight bit of funkiness to it as it does cool down into a little bit more of the sharp brightness with the slightly heavier chocolate. And I said, I'm having some really mixed feelings. I think this coffee is just improving with time, but I don't necessarily think that this 18-to-1 water to coffee ratio is really working for me. And we tried it one more time through the Chemex with H&S's recipe, and it's softer, yet still offering plenty of that tropical intensity with more of the passion fruit in that slightly diluted sense. It essentially leaves a very long-lasting passion fruit coated chocolate feel to the cup itself, so not necessarily the biggest fan of that. Day 35, I decided, okay, you know what? The trade-off for me will be, we'll keep these temperatures really low, but we're going to go back to a slightly more concentrated recipe at that 16-to-1, as those are the two recipes that they did have listed for this coffee specifically. And I think it helped. It offers a higher level of the apple and cherry brightness with tons of the tropical aspects to it. I just really ran out of space for notes on this, but I said, okay, you know what? I think I need the intensity for this coffee. Otherwise, it honestly just feels maybe a little bit too watery for me. All right. Let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a number of level 4s, and this tasting wheel looks very toned down for how intense this coffee was. But let's go through this tasting wheel. We'll start with the finish, level 4. So it did have a long-lasting finish to it, but I at no point felt that the finish was overbearing or too intense, even with the, we'll just say, stronger adjustments we had on the earlier days. So it's fine. A little bit more of a kind of lingering brightness, which is something we're going to discuss when we get to the brightness, but that seems to be the biggest takeaway I had from this coffee within the finish, in addition to some slight bit of funkiness and heaviness to it. Sweetness, level 3, level 4. And I think, interestingly enough, this is a little bit more of a true level 4. There's a slight bit of a candied sweetness to it, but also keep in mind that we're making this tasting wheel side by side with another H&S coffee that we're discussing. And I did have to say that this one, while it does offer plenty of the, we'll just say, more intense aspects of it, I think the other parts of this coffee are going to kind of dominate the sweetnesses. It's sweet, but we're going to move on to the next thing, which is the acidity at a level 4. And honestly, that could be a level 5. This is one of the highest level 4s I think we've discussed, and that's why I was alluding to the roast profile on this one, because there is so much brightness in this coffee, man. I really played around with the idea of maybe putting it at level 5 in terms of the brightness, because I had already made pretty much the entirety of the tasting wheel and said, do I want to go back and adjust it, or do I just kind of want to discuss it? I think I just want to discuss it. There's so much of that listed apple brightness in addition to that sort of tropical brightness. It is just such a lingering bright coffee, and that's the most intense experience I have in terms of the finish, is the brightness of this coffee. So this is a pretty acidic coffee, which I'm not entirely sure I would have expected going into it, but given that those are the notes that they have listed on this coffee, it makes a lot of sense, though still to me, just surprised by how much brightness there was in this one. Berry fruit, level 4. So they do have a cherry, cherry Tootsie Pop or something along those lines listed on here. Yeah, I can see that, though I have to say that I'm very happy that it didn't offer that sort of cherry cordial, that extremely intense cherry chocolate aspect to it. Though both of those things were present, they weren't overbearing or a little bit, we'll say, alcoholic, fermenty in that sense. So having that at the level 4, but maybe a little less intense than the majority of more processed coffees, I can live with that. Same thing with the citrus brightness, level 4, and I did mention that it just has that tropical citric aspect to it. Even then, I wouldn't say it's overly well defined. It's a little bit more generic. They also have that apple listed on here, and that's the other part that's going into it. As I do have to say that there was some interesting definition to that aspect of this coffee, so I could see that note on here, and both of those things make a lot of sense. Let's move on. Chocolate level 3. I do have to say that it still had that kind of slightly more robust chocolate aspect that comes from slightly more processed Honduran coffees. So that was an ever-present component to it. I don't know if that's listed in that cherry Tootsie Pop, but if it isn't, then that's what I'm getting from it. In addition to that, caramel level 4, level 3. There is certainly a kind of caramelized candied aspect to this coffee, and that's why I can kind of see that note making a lot of sense too. We'll discuss one more thing real quick, which is the body at a level 2. I think I was really surprised that this coffee didn't have as much texture or body to it. This tasting wheel is a little bit of an anomaly because I'm not entirely sure that this looks the way that this coffee tastes, mostly because this coffee is still intense and it still skews in so many directions, but I would have never expected the body to be on the lighter side of things, but it is level 2, and I was surprised when I was making it, but even now looking back on it, between 2 and a 3 seems the right place for it. then the final thing worth discussing is the cleanliness level 3. So yeah, they do have funk detected on this one, and there's a little bit of a funkiness, a little bit of a fermentiness. Both those things are felt. A little bit of a heaviness to this coffee, but I have to say the definition to some of the aspects in it were kind of nice. I mentioned that the apple-like component to it was definitely noticeable. The chocolate aspect wasn't too heavy or overbearing. There's a candied aspect to it, and then the tropics, while at times can skew a little bit too much in terms of a generic brightness, they're definitely a present aspect to it. And given that there's not too much to kind of take away from the overall clarity to it, the level 3 felt like the best place for it, though it had those aspects that kind of took it away from reaching that level 4 mark. And I don't think that anyone would necessarily, or they would necessarily argue with a level 3. I feel like that's pretty good for this coffee. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I don't think it's a good looking representation of this coffee, but I think basically what we've discussed is a actual representation of what we're getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. As I mentioned, on paper, this one wasn't necessarily the type of coffee that I was expecting myself to enjoy, and I wish I would have held back a little longer on purchasing from them, mostly because they released that natural processed Mejorado that seems to be getting a lot of positive reviews from so many people, and I'm very curious about that coffee. I'm really hoping to procure a sample here either in the near future or by the time this video is being released to try it for myself. But that's probably the coffee that I would have enjoyed a little bit more than this one. But this one right here, I guess it was interesting. It was a little unique. It was a little different from a lot of the things that I've had recently. The fact that the brightness is probably the highest I've had from a coffee that isn't maybe overly processed is interesting in itself, and there's just so much intensity to it. But I think what really kind of held this coffee back from maybe having a little bit more enjoyable of an experience was how much tinkering I was doing with it, mostly because H&S's recipe is just a little out there for what I typically do with most coffees. So these very heavy and intense adjustments seem to kind of leave me in this middle ground where I said, the best of this coffee is somewhere between where I first started and this recipe that I've had, and I just have, I would say, too few cups to actually work with and get it right. So for that reason, I'll put it on myself, though I don't necessarily think that this was ever going to be a type of coffee that I was specifically going to enjoy. I think this was much more of an experience for one of their non-wash processed coffees. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you really enjoy your brightness, I want you to try this one. This one's just really, really bright in so many regards. Tropicality, that sort of apple brightness, and in addition to that, it's offering some nice candied aspects to it. It does have a little bit of, we'll just say, depth. It isn't necessarily a one-note coffee. You are experiencing a little bit of some different characteristics from time to time, some candied aspects to it, and then, of course, that cherry aspect. So definitely quite a few things to pick out from this one, but for the most part, I think that's the best way to leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Mundo honey processed Honduras from H&S Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.